Okay, today's lesson is going to be on the miter saw, commonly referred to as the chop saw because of the chopping action that a chop saw has, right? The miter saw has. So there's actually three different kinds of miter saws that are out there. One being a little bit more advanced than the other. The basic miter saw, if we walk over here, we probably can see this isn't exactly the basic one, but a basic miter saw will do a chopping action, and I can change the angles left and right. Right? I can cut left and right. That is just your basic run-of-the-mill chop saw, miter saw. Okay, that's what it can do. If you have a compound miter saw, which is what this one is, it will do those same actions, left and right, this way. But I can also take the blade and tilt it left and right. And there's a knob in the back. If I loosen that, it will allow me to tilt it to an angle. Lots of different angles. Sometimes you have to move the fence out of the way. It'll bump into that. But, so I can tilt it and cut at an angle like this, and I can do it together. That's what a compound cut is. Angled left and right, and tilted to the side. So that's what we call a compound miter, okay? And sometimes, to use the two together, you have to really work off of a compound miter table. It tells you the two angles that you need for certain cuts. But usually, we'll cut one way or the other depending on what the situation is, as to what's going to be the most easiest way to do it. A nice compound miter saw will tilt left or right. This one does that. Usually there's a little stop. For example, this one, when it comes up to here, stops, but to go beyond it, you have to remember on this one where the button is, there's a release. I'm not going to play with it right now. It's on the side here. Nope, I'm wrong. But there is a release on this. Press the release and it allows it to go the other way. It took me a minute to figure it out. But I can go left or right with this miter saw. Once you get it where you want it, tighten it up, and away you go. And it's just a simple chopping action that it does. The bigger the blade, the deeper the cut you can make. They make some pretty large size miter saws, miter or compound miter for that. Okay, obviously the more things it'll do, the more it's going to cost. A regular miter saw is not as expensive as a compound miter because of the different things it'll do. The saw that we started at over here, the Makita that we've got, this is a sliding compound miter. This is the third style. This one will do a chop. It will tilt left and right. I can loosen the knob in the back and tilt it left and right. But as you see, it's kind of dancing back and forth here on me. This will slide as well. So I can make an extra deep cut. So I can actually come in from here and come down and cut something this wide. That's really, really wide, right? And again, the bigger the blade, the deeper it goes, but this one isn't as dependent on the size of the blade. Sometimes you'll see these sliding compound miters with a little teeny saw blade because of the sliding action, I could still cut a pretty wide board even with a smaller diameter blade, right? When it's using this function, it's very similar to a radial arm saw. Radial arm saw, we'll just take a quick walk over here, is this saw. Now radial arm saws are not popular anymore because the chop saw really outmoded the radial arm saw. Plus, this cuts kind of backwards. You're cutting the way the saw is spinning, so it kind of wants to come at you. We still use one just for rough cutting to length, but this does have that sliding action. Again, the downside is as you're cutting, it wants to come towards you, so you kind of have to hold it back. It's a little awkward. But when you cut with the sliding compound miter, which we'll do in a minute, you can come around from the other side and it doesn't have that problem. Okay? So the chop saw has pretty much outmoded the radial arm saw. So radial arm saws, I don't even know if they sell them anymore. Because nobody wants them. They're big, they're clumsy, they're heavy. These are small enough and light enough and portable enough that you can take them with you. Now we have these bolted to a bench, but the saw is only this big. So I can easily put this in a vehicle and drive it to a job site. They sell stands that you can put them on as well. So on the handout, you'll notice there are the three different types of chop saws. Now, let's jump back up on the handout here, talking about the purpose of the saw. It's really a cross-cutting saw. It's not designed to do rip cuts, so I'm not going to be cutting a board with the grain. I'm only cutting to length. All right? So, cut to exact finished lengths, cutting exact angles. All right? It's safe to cut rough lumber, and it's not for making rip cuts. It usually has a really fine blade on it, so I don't often use it for cutting rough lumber. I'm usually using it for making finished cuts to length. Now, if you've seen the table saw demonstration, we can cross-cut boards to length on a table saw. But let's say the table saws are busy. Let's say there are guys working on joinery or something on the table saw, they're going to be tied up for the whole period. You can cut your boards to length here. And if it's a really wide board, you can use the sliding compound miter. If it's not so wide, you can go over to the chop saw. By the way, this can be set up to be a chop saw as well. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I can take away the sliding capability of it and just use it as a chop. All right, so again, we have the three types. We have a miter saw, compound miter, and a sliding compound miter. So let's do a regular crosscut using the chop method, just a regular chop. Now, if this is the saw that I had, and I don't want it to slide, and I don't want to use the slide if I can make the cut here. So if the board is this wide or narrower, I don't need to use the sliding compound aspect to it. So just because that complicates the cut. So what I want to do is lock it in place. So on this side of the saw are a couple of things that lock it in place. Now the Makita, every brand is different. The Makita works with 2 bars on the bottom and 2 bars on the top. So see how the bottom will slide and the top will slide also? So it gives you quite a range of motion between the 2 slides. So you got to lock both of them. So when you push it, what I usually do is push it all the way back, and this lever here, if I pull it forward, that locks the bottom slide. So now the bottom won't slide, the top still will. So then I have to come over here and then just snug up this little knob here, and now nothing will slide. So that's how you take away the sliding aspect to this particular saw. Then I'm going to put my board against here, and there is some particular safety to this we should probably talk about before we go too far. And the safety rules are very, very similar to the radial arm saw because that has a similar function to it. All right. First of all, you would not try to cut little pieces. I'm not going to get my fingers down in here close to try to hold on to something little, especially if it spins around the little fence that's here and pulls my fingers in. So make sure this piece of wood is of some size, a good 6 inches or so long at least. All right. And especially on the left side, you want to have it open so you can have your hand out here. Never cross your hands when using the saw, so I wouldn't do one of these. I have my right hand to my right and my left hand to my left. If for some reason I'm cutting with the board on this side, I'm going to work at lefty. I'm going to hold here. I'm not going to do this because my arm is kind of in the path of the blade. I want to be balanced. Now, some saws, the motor's right here, so this is not preferable to work it on this side typically because of the motor. This saw has a pretty open view, so that's not too bad. But the wall over there, we'll make a cut over there in a minute. You can see that that's a little bit more hidden. You want to make sure that the board is tight to the fence. And the fence of the saw, not necessarily the table. I have this set up so that the saw is a little bit forward of the fence. You see the space here? If I hold this here, it's not going to sit nice on the saw. So I kind of ignore the fence and I just put this here. The fence is really there for us, just for a stop block. But I depend on the saw to hold it straight. Keep your hands out of the path of the blade. That's just a common sense thing. You can see where the blades go. It's very predictable. So if you keep your hands out of this area where the blue metal is, you'll be safe. The one thing you have to be careful of is when you're cutting an angle. So let me cut an angle this way. Set it up for that anyway. When I'm cutting here, you can see I'm cutting closer to where my hand is. So I have to be a lot more careful about the position of my hand if I'm cutting at a 90-degree angle, because the blade is kind of now goes from here to swinging over to where my hand is. So you got to be real careful. Maybe you want to bring it down with it off first to make sure your hand's still got a couple of inches of room at least, and then go ahead and make your cut. Okay. The nice thing about the chop saw is you can bring the blade down and touch the wood with it off and see exactly where it's going to cut with it in the off position. The board should be held against the table and the guide fence. We mentioned that. Make sure the appropriate clamps and locking handles are tight. Some of the operation on this, now every machine is different. So here we have our sliding mechanism locked. This one has a lever here for clicking into the different common angles. There's 15 degrees, there's 22.5. Of course, there's 90 degrees, 45 degrees, it clicks in. But what if I wanted something in the middle? Well, if I'm in the middle, let's say somewhere here, I wanted to lock it in there. On this machine, I release the clamp. There's a release in there. So I just turn it to the left, and now it's locked in. To unclamp it, you push it in and turn it to the right. To be honest, I don't like that setup. It's very unintuitive, but that's the way they designed it, so that's the way it is. That's the Makita setup. When we go over to the DeWalt later, I'll show you that one, which makes a little bit more sense to me. But anyway, I usually leave this one unlocked and just use the detents, and if you want to lock it in once it clicks in, then I can do that as well. Okay? So that's how you set your angles that you want. Shut off the power, wait till the saws come to a dead stop before making any adjustments. Most of these saws have an electronic brake in them, so they don't coast for very long. This one has a soft start. When it starts up, it doesn't jump all of a sudden. It's hard to see, but it does start with a little bit of a slower start. It doesn't start with a punch. Okay. And always ask permission before using this machine, just like any other machine. It's kind of our rule in our shop. Most of the saws have some kind of a little safety right here, so you don't accidentally grab the handle, because the trigger is part of the handle. So you have to push this safety in. I usually use this part of my hand. Some people like to do it this way. I just put my hand right on it, and it allows me to start. This one also has a laser on it. Kind of shows you roughly where the blade's going to be. Now the laser can go down one side of the blade or the other, depending on which side you're cutting on. And the control for that is right here. So this is now cut, the laser's on the left side of the blade. If I push this knob over, now the laser's on the right side of the blade. I don't really use the laser a lot, just because the laser, even the line, it's kind of cool, it's a laser, but it does have a thickness, and I like to just bring the blade right down to the work and check it that way. And if I forgot to put it to the right side of the blade, I could accidentally cut on the wrong side. So I'd much rather bring the blade down and touch it before I make the cut. The on-off switch for the laser, if you don't want it on, is on the top. Okay, so that's what that is. So if I'm making a regular cross cut, I'm going to hold it tight to the fence and against the table. Make sure my hand is in a safe place. I call it a chop saw, but you don't want to chop down fast, because you end up with a pretty lousy cut. But if you cut nice and slow, it's hard to see in the video, but this is an extremely smooth cut. That's silky smooth right there, because the blade has a lot of teeth. The more teeth you have per inch, the finer the cut will be. It'll cut a little slower, but it leaves a much, much nicer surface. So this blade is designed just for cross cutting and designed for a chop saw, so it's very particular for that kind of a cut. If I wanted to cut an angle, I could swing this around to, let's say, 45. And if I had a line that I was cutting to, let's say I wanted to cut a 45-degree angle. Maybe I have a line that I want to cut to. So let's draw one. So let's say I want to cut right on that line. Let's say this is my scrap. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in here, bring the saw blade down, and sneak it up. I'm looking right through the back of the guard here. It has a slit so I can see right down the side of the blade. And even if I bring it down, I can touch the wood and I can see exactly where it's going to cut. Bring it up. Make my cut. Make sure this comes all the way up before you reach in here for your piece of wood. Make sure the guard returns. And again, nice even cut. Okay. Now let's cut something that's wide, so we can see that sliding action, because that's a little different. This might be a little wider than the saw can do as in a chopping action. So let's say I wanted to cut this with the slide, using the slide mechanism. So I'm going to release the slide so that this will work. And I'm not going to come down this way, because if you think about the way the blade is spinning, it's going to want to roll towards me, okay? Which is kind of what the radial arm saw does, and then that creates all kinds of other issues. I really want to cut going that way, not this way. So what this saw does, it allows you to come over the piece of wood and come down and cut going this way, which you can't do on a radial arm saw. So what you do is you actually pull the saw towards you, start it, and cut going forward. And that's the right way to cut with a sliding compound miter. And of course, I would line the line up so that the saw blade's cutting on the scrap side of the line like I normally would. All right? But that's when you would use the slide. But don't use the slide unless you really need it, because it's just another thing to deal with. So let's take a look at the other machine. So let's just make sure we covered all the bases here. Yeah, let's come over to the other chop saw. And we'll just talk about this one for a minute. couple of other variable things here that just a little different. On this one, it's just a different brand. The way this one locks, which to me makes much more sense, instead of the twisting mechanism, if I wanted to lock it somewhere in the middle, I just push this down and that locks in place. All right. Underneath is the release for the detent, so you can see all the little stops that we're talking about here, the common locking points. This one also has a little adjustment. I can inch off of the detents one way or the other, just a little bit with these little black things here. That's what that's all about. If I wanted to do, again, a regular chop cut, if this was my mark, and I wanted to cut to there, I don't even need a line all the way across. And this one has a grill that you can see through. I can look right down the side of the blade, line it up, lift it up. Now this one doesn't have that soft start, so when you see how it jumps a little bit, so you can either let it come all the way up and start it, or just be ready for that little jump. And cut that right off. Now, sometimes if you're cutting off something really little, like a skinny piece, as you come back up, that little piece will fall into the blade. If the blade's still spinning, it'll ricochet out. So if that's the case, make your cut and then let it stop in the down position. Once it's down, then come up, and that won't be a problem. That's one common thing. Now, if you wanted to do a miter cut, and this holds for both saws, where you wanted to tilt the saw sideways, I think I mentioned it before, if you're not careful, the saw will come down on the fence. So what you have to do is, if you are going to cut an angle, release the knob in the back and pull this part of the fence backwards, all right, so that when you're making the cut, it's out of the way. Okay, and again, you want to be careful when you start doing angles that you're not angling into where your hand is. And again, operate it. The best way to operate it is a righty, even if you're a lefty, because the way the handle's set. But if you're a lefty, you want to make sure you're right here where you can see your hand. Don't be crisscrossed. Now, the advantage of a chop saw is finished cut, and it's really easy to set up stop blocks. We have these fancy stop blocks that are on here, so if I had several boards that I had to cut to a particular length, I would take the first one, and I'd square one end on all my boards first, and usually what I do when I cut boards to length is I'll put a little scribble on both ends, right? And then trim my best end first. Now this end's got a big old split in it, so what I would do here is trim this end square. Let's make believe we didn't do that yet. So I would come over here, trim one end square. Now the end without any pencil lines I know is square. So let's say I needed this 12 inches long. I could measure my 12 inches from my good end, make a mark, and if I wanted to take a square and draw a longer line, I could. Make sure you use a square, not just a ruler, because a ruler could be crooked. Use a square to get a 90-degree line on there, and then bring it down so that it's going to cut on the scrap side of the line. But if I've got to cut multiple ones, I want to use a stop block. Okay, so in this case, now I'm cutting a straight cut so I can push this back. Now in this case, I could use this stop block, but I don't think it's going to reach because the board's not quite long enough. So that's not going to work. But if it was a longer board, I could certainly do that. I would use a stop block, by the way, for anything where I have two or more pieces the same length. So what I could do is get a piece of scrap wood. I was doing this on the table saw before. Get a piece of scrap wood and a clamp, and then just clamp that piece of scrap excuse me, to my fence. Make sure it's touching. Right? And then put this here so it's touching, make my cut. I don't have it set at 90. And slide it over and do my next cut. Excuse me. That way I can get multiple pieces all exactly the same length. Okay? So that's nice on a chop saw. Excuse me. Breathing too much sawdust today. So we talked about angled cuts, we talked about bevel cuts, making sure you move the fence. On the sliding compound miter, make sure it's locked if you're going to use it just as a chop saw. If you need the longer cut, unlock everything and make the cut by pulling it towards you, then come down behind the blade and make the cut as you push away. not like on a radial lump saw where you do it when you're pushing it towards you. If the stock is bowed for some reason, let's say the board has a curve to it down its length, best not to do it so that it's up in the air where you're cutting, because as it cuts, it's going to come down and pinch the saw blade. So if the board for some reason has a little bit of a curve, let it be touching where the blade is and up in the air on one side or the other. That way, as it cuts, it falls away from the blade. Rarely does that happen. Usually, if by this point you're dealing with squared stock, which should be straight and flat, but every once in a while that might happen. Again, make sure your hands are always outside that danger zone. And on small pieces, let the saw stop in the down position and then bring it up so that that little piece doesn't ricochet around. And that's the miter saws. Miter saw, this is a compound miter, also bevels as well as tilts, and a sliding compound miter.